The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the ballroom of the Riverside Country Club, their light dancing off champagne glasses and elegant gowns. Margaret Chen stood near the marble pillars, her fingers nervously smoothing the pale blue fabric of her borrowed dress. At 53, she still carried herself with a quiet grace, though life had taught her to move through the world more carefully than she once had. She hadn't wanted to come tonight. Charity galas weren't her world anymore. Not since the divorce 3 years ago, when David had left her for someone younger, someone who fit better into his new life as a successful investment banker. But her daughter Emma had insisted, practically begging her to attend as her +1. Emma was receiving an award for her non-profit work, and Margaret couldn't say no to that proud smile. Now, as she watched the crowd of well-dressed guests mingling and laughing, Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Somewhere in this room, David was here too. Emma had mentioned it casually, trying to sound nonchalant, but Margaret had seen the worry in her daughter's eyes. "Mom, you look beautiful," Emma whispered, squeezing her hand before being pulled away by one of the event organizers. Margaret managed to smile and nodded, watching her daughter disappear into the crowd. She took a slow breath and reminded herself why she'd come. This wasn't about David. This was about supporting Emma, about showing up even when it was hard. She was reaching for a glass of water from a nearby table when she heard that familiar laugh, smooth and confident, cutting through the ambient conversation like a knife. Her hand froze mid-reach. Turning slowly, she saw him across the room. David Chen, 57 now, still handsome in that polished way of his dark hair showing distinguished threads of silver at the temples. He wore an expensive suit, custom-tailored, and stood with his arm around a woman Margaret didn't recognize. Young, blonde, probably in her early 30s. The woman laughed at something he said, touching his chest in that casual, intimate way that made Margaret's stomach turn. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, David's expression shifted, surprise, then something that might have been discomfort, but it quickly transformed into that smug look she'd come to know so well in their final years together. He leaned down, whispered something to his companion, and then deliberately began walking in Margaret's direction. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. All those months of therapy, all those mornings of telling herself she'd moved on, and here she was, feeling 15 again, unprepared and vulnerable. "Margaret," David said, reaching her with the blonde woman still attached to his arm. "I didn't expect to see you here. You look, well." It was the pause that stung, that tiny hesitation that said everything. "Hello, David," Margaret managed, keeping her voice steady. "This is Brittany," he continued as if Margaret had asked. "Brittany, this is my ex-wife, Margaret." The young woman extended a perfectly manicured hand, her smile bright and utterly unbothered. "Oh, it's so nice to meet you. David talks about you sometimes. You used to work in, what was it, honey? Was it accounting?" "I was a CPA," Margaret said quietly. "I had my own practice." "Had?" David raised an eyebrow. "That's right. You closed it down after, well, how are you managing these days?" The implication hung in the air. Margaret felt her face grow warm. Yes, she'd closed her practice during the divorce. The stress had been too much, and she'd needed time to rebuild herself. She'd been working as a bookkeeper for a small local business for the past 2 years, honest work, but nothing like what she'd built before. "I'm doing fine," she said, lifting her chin slightly. David's smile widened. "That's good to hear. I was worried, you know. At our age, starting over can be challenging." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. She opened her mouth, though she had no idea what words would come out, when a deep voice spoke from just behind her. "There you are, darling. I've been looking everywhere for you." A man stepped up beside Margaret, and she felt a gentle hand rest on her lower back, warm, steady, protective. She turned startled, and found herself looking up into kind grey eyes set in a distinguished face. He was perhaps 58 or 60, with silver hair swept back from a strong forehead, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that spoke of understated wealth. There was something solid about him, something quietly powerful in the way he carried himself. "I'm sorry I was detained," he continued smoothly, his voice carrying that slight rasp that comes with age and experience. "You know how these business calls are." He turned to David and Brittany with a polite smile. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met. I'm Thomas Bradford. Margaret's mind raced. She had no idea who this man was. But something in his eyes, a gentle kindness, an understanding, made her pause before pulling away. David's expression had shifted entirely. Thomas Bradford, of Bradford Industries? The same, Thomas said easily, his hand still resting protectively on Margaret's back. And you are? David Chen, I'm in investment. Banking with Morrison and Associates. David's voice had taken on a different quality now, eager, almost deferential. It's an honor to meet you, sir. We actually handled some portfolios that include several of your holdings. Is that so? Thomas's tone was pleasant but non-committal. He glanced down at Margaret with such warmth that she almost believed they actually knew each other. Darling, didn't you mention you were getting a bit tired? Perhaps we should find somewhere quieter to sit before Emma's presentation. Margaret's heart was still racing, but she found herself nodding. Yes, that would be lovely. Thomas guided her away with a gentle pressure on her back, nodding politely to David and Brittany as they left. Margaret could feel David's eyes following them, could sense his confusion, and was that actually concern on his face? They walked in silence until they reached a quieter corner of the ballroom, near tall windows that overlooked the garden. Only then did Thomas's hand fall away from her back, and he turned to face her with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry for the presumption, he said softly. I was standing nearby and couldn't help but overhear. You looked like you needed, well, an exit strategy. Margaret found herself laughing, a real laugh that surprised her. That's one way to put it. She studied his face, taking in the crow's feet around his eyes, the gentle smile lines. He had the kind of face that had lived a full life. Thank you. That was incredibly kind, and I'm sorry you got dragged into my mess. No mess at all, Thomas assured her. And I'm afraid I wasn't entirely honest a moment ago. I do know who you are, or rather, I know of Emma Chen. Your daughter's work with literacy programs in underserved communities is remarkable. My foundation has been following her organization for months now. Oh, Margaret said, surprised. Emma never mentioned. She doesn't know yet. We were planning to approach her tonight, actually, about a potential partnership. He paused, then added gently, and I also happen to know that the woman who founded and ran a successful CPA practice for 20 years before taking a step back to focus on her own healing is someone to be admired, not pitied. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. You did your research. I always do, Thomas said simply. My wife passed away 4 years ago. Cancer. We'd been married for 33 years. He looked out at the garden, his expression thoughtful. People think that starting over after 50 is some kind of tragedy. I used to think that too, but I've learned that sometimes starting over is actually an act of courage. It takes strength to rebuild. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people who understood something about loss and survival. That was my ex-husband, Margaret said finally. David. He left me 3 years ago for someone younger. I thought I was over it, but seeing him tonight, hearing that tone in his voice. She trailed off, shaking her head. The tone that suggests you're somehow less than you were. Thomas asked gently. I understand that feeling. After Catherine died, people looked at me differently, like I was incomplete somehow, as if a person needs to be part of a pair to have value. Yes, Margaret breathed. Exactly that. Thomas turned back to her, and there was something in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps of a kindred spirit. Margaret, I hope this doesn't sound too forward, but would you consider continuing this charade for the rest of the evening, just until your daughter's presentation is over? I have a feeling your ex-husband might continue to make things uncomfortable otherwise. And frankly, he smiled a bit sheepish, I could use the company. These events can be rather lonely when you're attending alone. Margaret looked at him, this stranger who had appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right words. There was no pressure in his request, no expectation, just an offer of mutual support between two people who'd both survived their own storms. I'd like that, she said softly. Thank you, Thomas. The next hour passed in a gentle blur. Thomas stayed by her side, not possessively but companionably, and Margaret found herself relaxing in his presence. They talked about small things, the absurdity of the tiny appetizers being passed around, the architecture of the building, the unseasonably warm weather. Thomas had a dry sense of humor that snuck up on you, delivering observations in that calm, measured voice that made her smile. Twice more they encountered David and Brittany. Both times Margaret felt Thomas's subtle support, a slight lean in her direction, a hand at the small of her back, a warm look that suggested years of shared history rather than minutes of conspiracy. David's expression grew more strained each time, and Margaret realized with some surprise that she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just a quiet sense of having moved beyond that chapter. When Emma took the stage to accept her award, Margaret's eyes filled with tears, the good kind this time. Her daughter spoke eloquently about the importance of literacy and education, about second chances and the power of community support. Watching her, Margaret felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with David, nothing to do with their failed marriage. Emma had become this remarkable person, not because of her parents' relationship or its ending, but in spite of it all. Thomas leaned close during the applause and whispered, "You should be very proud." "I am," Margaret whispered back, and meant it with her whole heart. As the evening wound down and guests began filtering out to the parking lot, Thomas walked Margaret to her car. The night air was cool and fresh, a relief after the warmth of the ballroom. "Thank you again," Margaret said, turning to face him under the soft glow of the parking lot lights. "For everything, for rescuing me, for staying, for just being kind." Thomas smiled, and there was something gentle in his expression. "Would it be too presumptuous to ask if I could call you sometime? Just for coffee, perhaps? I find I'd like to continue our conversation." Margaret felt her heart skip, not with anxiety this time, but with something that felt almost like hope. "I'd like that too." They exchanged numbers, and as Margaret drove home that night, she realized something had shifted inside her. For 3 years she'd been carrying the weight of David's judgment, his dismissal, his suggestion that she was somehow diminished by their divorce and her age. But tonight, in the span of a few hours, a stranger had reminded her of something she'd forgotten. She wasn't starting over because she'd failed. She was starting over because she'd survived. And survival, real survival, required more strength than simply staying the same. The next morning, Margaret woke to a text from Thomas. "Thank you for the lovely evening. I hope this isn't too forward, but I wanted you to know that my foundation would very much like to discuss a partnership with Emma's organization. Would you be willing to help me arrange a meeting?" She smiled and typed back, "I'd be happy to help." And Thomas, "Thank you for reminding me who I am." His response came quickly, "You did that yourself. I just held up a mirror." 3 months later, Margaret sat across from Thomas at a small cafe downtown, the autumn sun streaming through the windows and warming her hands, wrapped around a coffee mug. They met here twice a week now, sometimes to discuss Emma's growing partnership with Bradford Foundation, sometimes just to talk about life. Thomas had become a friend, a real friend, the kind you don't find often at any age. They shared a comfortable understanding born of having both lived long enough to know that life rarely goes according to plan, and that sometimes the detours lead somewhere better than the original destination. "I saw David last week," Margaret mentioned, stirring sugar into her coffee. "At the grocery store of all places." "How did that feel?" Thomas asked, his grey eyes attentive. "Fine, actually. We said hello. It was fine." She smiled, surprised by her own honesty. "I think I've finally let it go. Really let it go." "Good," Thomas said simply. "You deserve that peace." They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd learned that life after 50 wasn't about being less. It was about being more yourself, more honest, more willing to embrace whatever comes next. And for Margaret, whatever came next didn't feel frightening anymore. It felt like possibility. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If it touched your heart or reminded you of your own journey, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about life, love, and second chances. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment where a stranger's kindness changed your perspective? Your stories matter, and I'm here to listen. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to start a new chapter.